Well, that's with Elise Doucette. Now we've been able to fix that line, so let's go back to David Levine, who's an Elections Integrity Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. As of course we've seen early voting start in Florida. We were just talking before the line dropped out, David, that 28 million Americans so far have voted, which is an extraordinary number. And you were just giving us your reaction, your response to that.
Matthew, thanks so much for having me on. I absolutely agree with you. It's a remarkable number, and I hope more people take advantage of it. Early voting is good for three reasons, at least. Number one, election security. We know that if any issues arise during early voting, voters have the potential to vote either subsequently by mail or potentially in person closer to Election Day. We know it's also good from a public health perspective. Right? The more spread out voting is, the less likely voters can contract the coronavirus. And number three, early voting is good for election administrators. We understand that at the state and local level, administrators are doing everything they can to run these elections as well as possible. And the more folks who vote ahead of time, that means that there's less pressure on Election Day for those folks running our elections.
In terms of that last thought, this is an election unlike any other. So will we get a result on the night, as per usual?
That's an excellent question, Matthew. You know, while the tradition may be that we've been able to announce election results on election night, that's not how our system is designed, right? Each state has a process post-election night where they can both, in some cases, receive additional ballots, as well as being able to validate those results and certify them subsequently after Election Day. And so while there's a potential for having election night results, I think folks ought to be prepared for the possibility that election night results might take days or even potentially weeks to be fully decided, and that's absolutely okay.
You say it's okay, but it could be messy if you end up having both sides saying they've won the election. But we wait to see if that's an eventuality. But in different states, I mean, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, two battleground states, they don't begin pre-processing the ballots till Election Day itself. Florida, though, they pre-process 40 days before Election Day. Why is there such a difference?
That's a wonderful question. You know, I think one of the things that's really interesting to see, to your point, is the different practices that exist here in the states. And one of the advantages, of course, is it provides an opportunity for states to experiment and innovate. But one downside, of course, is the ability for all states to get on board with a given practice. And in terms of pre-processing ballots, I'd love to see as many states as possible be able to pre-process those ballots before Election Day, because to your point, the more time election officials have to pre-process those ballots, meaning getting them ready to tabulate on Election Day, the more likely we are to have results earlier. And so there's still a possibility that in places like Pennsylvania, we may be able to see election officials process those ballots ahead of Election Day, but we'll just have to wait and see.
A final question then, David. We've seen long queues already in other states where there's been early voting. A lot of talk about voter suppression. Kristen Clark, who's the president of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, said you have 11 hours of waiting for early voting in some parts of Georgia. Some of it is voter enthusiasm, but this is just not acceptable in a modern day democracy. Do you think she's right?
Well, I have a tremendous respect for Ms. Clark and the work her organization does, but I happen to think that when you're in a state like Georgia that not only has 3 weeks of early voting, right, but also the opportunity to vote by mail, and you're dealing with finite resources, that if there are longer lines at the beginning of early voting, that is not per se direct evidence of voter suppression. Now, if we were to continue to see longer lines as early voting continued, I think that would be something to look into. And to Ms. Clark's point, obviously, we don't want to have people waiting in line for any extended period of time, including what happened on the first day of early voting. But I think the jury's out on that particular piece. I think what folks need to be able to see is, number one, right, people need to be aware of what their options are. And number two, we need to be mindful about the different ways that folks are able to vote, right? And so one of the things I think that's really important to note is that if voters have options, one of the things that I think is really important is that if they go at a given point in time and then subsequently decide that they don't want to wait that long, it's okay for them to subsequently decide to vote on a different day. But I think to Mrs. Clark's point, I think it's really important to note that we want to make sure that voters are being processed as quickly as possible.
David, we have to leave it there, but I'm glad that we got the line back up working to you. Dave Levine, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme.